Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today on Dynamics SL Security. I am Dan Walsh. I am with SIS, and I've been a consultant here for almost 12 years, and I've been working with SL for almost 20 years, and about 5 or 6 of those years as an end user, as a controller for one of our clients. So I've worked quite a bit with the product. Today, we're going to cover the security model for SL. And it's not something that most companies think about or even deal with very often once they're up and running, but there are certain times when it becomes relevant, such as if you're adding new employees to as users to Dynamics SL, or if you're changing responsibilities, moving people around into different roles. Also, if you've purchased a company or you've been purchased by another SL company, there may be situations where you need to go in and update the access rights in the security model. If you make any changes that I would consider major changes, in other words, you're adding a lot of new groups or a lot of new companies, or you're going from a scenario where you have security set up for different companies and you're merging them into one company, I'd recommend you do a run in a test environment first and have some of your users go through their normal processes just to make sure that they don't run into any issues. Because if you're in a production environment and you make those changes, it can kind of create some havoc where people need to get things done. So definitely recommend you make those changes in a test environment. SL has 2 security models as far as gaining access to the actual application. The one is where you actually log into SL with a password. So when you're first log in, it brings up the little screen where you have your user ID, and then you have to put in a password. Most of our clients right now are using the opposite. They're using the Windows authentication, which allows you to log in using your Active Directory user rights, so that once you're logged into your computer and you go to your Dynamics application, it authenticates it based on the fact that you're logged into Windows. And every Windows user or every SL user is associated with an Active Directory user. So we'll take a look at that first. So when you set up the users, each user is going to have, oops, let me pick this admin. So the user that's logged into the Windows environment is going to have a Active Directory path. That's the domain and then the user ID. So that needs to be included whenever you set up the users, so that it associates that Active Directory user with the SL user. And you can see they don't have to be the same. I'm logged in as the administrator, but my SL password or user ID is admin. So they don't have to be the same. So in general, one of the most important things to consider when you're setting up security, it's going to be very unique to each organization. So you want to be very specific when you're setting up the rights. Even before you do anything in SL, I recommend you create some type of like a spreadsheet or a document that's going to list all the different users and groups and what their rights are. So most of the rights, for most of my clients, the rights are set up by groups versus users. I definitely do not recommend setting up access rights by users. It's just a lot more complicated. It takes a lot more time. Plus, if you have someone retires or someone comes in, you replace somebody, you'd have to go back in and set them up, versus just adding the new user into the same groups. So it's a lot simpler and a little more easier to manage if you do it by groups. A couple different ways to set up user rights. You can set them up by like a flow, like the functionality of what the processes are, or you can just put them into groups, like an AP group, a GL group, an AR group, or you can do a combination of both. I've seen both used quite a bit. It's also worth checking with your external audit company. So if you're going to have audits done and they're going to come in and review your books or issue an opinion, a lot of times they have to do a review of your security, like separation of duties, etc. So it's always good to check with them and see if they have any recommendations or see if they have any requirements, before you actually set it up. Okay, so most of the rights, you're going to set up the rights by groups. Definitely what we recommend. And you can have, as many groups as you want. SL, when you first load it up, it comes with some default groups like these CBS ones. I typically don't use those. If I'm starting with a new SL implementation, I'll just sit down with my client and I'll say, how many employees do you have? What different roles do they have? Kind of explain to them how the access rights work, and then they can get a better feel for what type of groups do we want. One thing you don't want is to have, in my opinion, is too many groups. I've gone into some clients, maybe we'll take on a new client and I'll look at their group setup and they'll have 30, 40, 50 groups. And I just look at that as kind of overkill. It kind of makes it a little harder to manage. So you really want to give a lot of good thought to the groups. They can either be role-based or module-based. But yeah, I don't like to see too many groups. I think it makes it a lot harder to manage. There's some third-party software out there too that you can consider when it comes to security. Privacy Manager is one. It's a third-party application that lets you just apply a lot more rules to the screens and to the applications. It's called Privacy Manager. Another one is called SL Auditor. SL Auditor doesn't provide so much security as it provides an audit trail. And sometimes security and audit trails are related. In other words, I want to know who changed something. With the SL Auditor, you can go in and it keeps a list of all the different changes that are made to all the different screens. So those are both third-party applications that if you're interested, reach out to Debbie Peavy at SIS, and she can get you some more details on those applications. One of the things that's difficult, separation of duties to me is important from an audit standpoint. I spent 5 years as an external auditor. And so if you can consider, and I know it's harder in a smaller organization, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. In other words, the person that's creating new vendors maybe shouldn't be the person that can write checks. You usually try and keep those separate. And some of that can be achieved, through the security model in SL. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the process of setting up a group, users, adding users to the groups, and then assigning access rights to those. One of the things that SL does that kind of related to the audit trail in a very kind of minimal way is it has 4 fields that it keeps track of. And every screen, every data maintenance screen, every data element, when you enter it, it keeps track of who created it, the user that created it, the date it was created, and also keeps track of the last person that updated it and the date that they updated it. And those fields can be added to any screen in SL. So if we would look at the vendor maintenance screen, and I've added to this screen for a number of clients, the person that created it and the person that last updated it, and also the date. Sometimes we'll put the date in there so that if someone has a question, oh, this changed, they can see without going into the database tables, they can see that information. And that can be added using the customization manager. So you can just go into the all users mode and add those fields to pretty much any screen in SL, transaction screens and maintenance screens. Another interesting aspect of customization manager is you can actually have customization groups. And using customization groups is nice because you can assign users to a group. And probably the most common use for this that I've found is in, like, let's say the journal transaction screen. You can have one person enter the journal transaction, but they can't release it. Someone else signs in and they can actually review it and then release the journal entry. And that's controlled through customization groups. You can create a customization group and then assign people to it. And then you can do customizations. Instead of at the all level, which is typically where you're going to do customizations, you can do them at the group level, right? So if you have someone in a group and you can restrict the ability to release a batch or to release a journal entry, then someone else can sign in and actually review it and release it. So it's something to keep in mind. A lot of people don't utilize that functionality, but I find it can be very useful. The only really limit on it is that you can't have one person cannot belong to more than one customization group. So it does have some limits. Okay, so creating groups is pretty simple. You just come up with a good group ID. And I like the group ID, the name, to be pretty applicable to what I'm doing. You know, it's AP, it's a controller group, maybe it's a project controller group, it's the inventory group, warehouse group, whatever it is. I like to try and keep it very descriptive. So once we've picked a group, then we just have to assign the users to it. And the thing about SL and the overall appearance, the menus that they belong to are also important. I'm not going to cover the menu maintenance today, but menu maintenance determines what they can see. It doesn't give them rights to it. But if they have rights to it, you don't have them in the menu group, they may not see that functionality. So it's important that the menus and the groups kind of go hand in hand. And I think it was sometime last year I did a webinar on menu maintenance. So if you were interested in getting getting the video of that, the recording of that, you can reach out to WPV and she could provide you a link to that. But we're not going to cover menus today. Okay, so once you've created the groups, then it's a matter of adding users to the group, and you can do that in the group maintenance, or in the user level, you can add users to groups, right? Let me find one. So each user then can be assigned to groups. There's really not a need to use these checkboxes up here very much. I've never really used these. In the application server, in all my use of, that's for the quick send functionality, I've never had to check that box to have the quick sends work. There is a default list lookup behavior. So when you do an F3 on any of the fields in SL, you can change what the default lookup behavior is, right? Contains or begins with. Contains is the normal one, and that's the default. So I typically don't change that. If you've created a customization group, you can add the user to it here just by doing the lookup. And on the users, again, if you're set up for Windows Authentication, you have to put in the path, as I mentioned before. You can also change the required field color, which typically is not a big deal. You can also add a home page so that when they log in, they'll see a certain website when they log in. Okay, so once you have your group set up and the users assigned to your groups, the next part is to add the access rights to that group. Definitely want to do it by group. There's a few situations I've had where it was applicable to put in a user access rights, but 99% of the time you're going to want to assign access rights by groups. And the key is that you've gone through and determined that, this is the way we want our security structured, this is the way we want our access rights assigned. So once you've created those groups, then it's a matter of going in and saying, we're going to assign these different screens and different types of access to each screen based on that group. And there's two different ways to do it. If you have multiple companies, you could do it on an individual company basis by looking up the company. Or if you check the all companies box, the rights will apply to all the companies. I've seen a mix of both. I recently had a company that had about 20 different companies, and they grew. They started out from maybe 3 or 4 companies, and they were doing access rights by company. And as they grew, it just got to be just too much work. It just was very hard to maintain. So we switched them over to all companies. And as part of that process, we did what I mentioned earlier is we took a spreadsheet and we said, okay, here's the different companies, here's the different users, right? And we did it so that it would blend them all together and that we had a really good model, for one company, for all the same rights, but we moved some of the users around to fit in with the security model that they needed. So once you have your group set up, you've assigned your users to the groups, it's easiest to come in here and to do a preload, especially if you're starting, with a new setup. And you can set it up, you'll see you'll have all the different modules listed, and doing a preload will put all the different screens in for that module, and you can do you can click multiple ones at a time. When I told it, okay, it's going to load all the different screens for those modules into the access rights grid. When it first loads them in, it's going to give them only view rights. And the difference between these, so view rights are intended just for that purpose. So a person can go in and open vendor maintenance if they only have view rights, but everything will be grayed out. They can't do any modifications, they can't delete, they can't add, they can only view it. If you have view and update, they can't create a new customer record or vendor record, but they can update them, make changes to them. If you have insert or delete, you can insert new ones or delete records. The delete function is very limited in most cases, especially on the maintenance screens. If you're in like the vendor maintenance or customer maintenance or inventory items, you can't delete an item that's been used at some point in the system in a transaction, and it'll tell you that. But in most of the screens, you can make it inactive. Like in customers and inventory, you can make it inactive so that it won't show up whenever you do like an F3 when you do your lookups, but you won't be able to delete it. So what you want to do is you want to look at these screens. Normally, I like to start with all the screens. You can leave view rights in there, even if it's a screen that you don't want them to touch, or you can delete that screen. I prefer to delete it so that they don't see it at all. So if I go into like an AP, there's a setup screen. I don't want anyone to see the setup screen, typically other than maybe the administrators. So I would just go in and delete those, hitting the delete key. Same with AP integrity check. So for the normal AP user, I don't want them to see that screen, right? And I'm also not included in their menu options. So the cleaner you keep the SL interface, to me, the better. Makes it easier for the end users. So when you look at this and you say, okay, I've decided for this group what screens they're going to see, and for this group what access they're going to have. So if I decide that I want to give them full access, and you see if I click on delete, it checks the boxes to the left of it. And if it's a report, you won't be able to change any access rights because it is strictly a view situation. So you see, I try and click on a report one, it won't let me do that. If I click on insert, it'll let me insert and update. If I click on update, so you can see it's kind of just by clicking on it, changes the boxes to the left. Another nice thing that you can do is you can do a copy and paste once you've made a selection. So if I'm in here and I do a Control C, and I can go down and highlight X number of rows and do a Control V paste, and it'll put all those in for me. So I don't have to go one at a time and go down. I'll do that a lot of times. Then I can go backwards and say, okay, you know what? I don't want them, to do ledger maintenance, right? Then I can back up and uncheck boxes. And you can see if I check the one on the left, it unchecks the ones on the right. So just makes it a little easier, a little quicker to do these updates. Once you've made the changes, just go ahead and save it. And your access rights are complete. There's some groups in here that are there's two groups that are just kind of generic groups. We'll take a quick look at those. One's called the administrators. And I definitely recommend not putting too many users in here. Typically, it's going to be the sysadmin user, the Windows Active Directory user associated with the sysadmin, and maybe one or two other people, maybe the controller, at least two other. I'd have at least two other people. So someone like the controller or administrative, somebody is going to have rights to the administrators group, because that gives them pretty much free reign within SL to make changes, to add users, to add access rights, They can get pretty much into any screen and process transactions. The other group is called Everyone. It's kind of a generic group. It gives people strictly just view rights to everything that's in SL. So if you're creating a new user, you might want to throw them in the Everyone group to start with. That way they can at least log in and look at the menus, but they won't be able to do anything. So you don't really need to have anybody in the Everyone group once the rights have been assigned, but it is a kind of a default group that comes within SL. That's pretty much the basics of SL security. It's not very cumbersome or complicated, but you really want to give a lot of thought into setting up these rights, even if you're an established company, especially from an audit standpoint and separation of duties. I think it's really important. You know, to every once in a while, maybe to do a review of this, especially if you've had changeover in personnel, or if you've made some major changes in your the way your company is organized or structured. It's definitely worth taking a look at, and we can help with that. If you get into a situation where you're not sure, you have some questions about how you're structured now or how you want it to be structured, we can certainly assist with that. So certainly, if you have any questions after viewing this webinar, please reach out to either myself or Debbie Peavy. We'll have some links in the email to the recording of this, and also to some links into reaching out to people at SIS. So definitely, if you have any questions or if you have any situations that you want to discuss with us, please feel free to reach out. Try to keep it kind of short and quick today. Like I said, it's not a very complicated process, but on the other hand, it is extremely important to protect the integrity of your organization, the data, the separation of duties, like I mentioned a number of times, having been an auditor, I think that's very important. The menu maintenance, definitely another consideration. Reach out to Debbie Peavy if you want to take a look at that webinar presentation. I think that's it for today, but thanks for joining us. Thanks for watching this, and I hope to hear from you. Thank you.